Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, and welcome to the last day of the week-long whirlwind that is Pivot 2021. I'm Ann Robertson-Tate, president of Geothermex, a geothermal consultancy that was established in the 1970s. I'm a geologist. I've focused on conceptualizing and quantifying conditions deep underground, often with very sparse data, particularly for early stage projects. This creates a technical risk for geothermal projects, which is gradually reduced as the subsurface is more fully known, investigated, interrogated. There's some pretty interesting mitigation approaches to those risks, which have been discussed here at Pivot and in many other contexts. But today's Pivot session is not about technical risk. It's about non-technical risks that might be holding geothermal back, such as how resources are classified and described, safety issues, environmental issues, stakeholder engagement. Left unresolved, these issues will come back to bite us. They will limit or deter investment in geothermal projects, slowing the pace of development at a time when it's critically needed, which is now. These non-technical risks need to be mitigated too. With that as a short introduction to our topic, I'm going to invite each member of our panel to take a minute to introduce themselves, telling us who they are, their technical specialties, what organizations they're affiliated with, and their involvement with geothermal energy. Let's start with Kate Young.
Good morning, and thanks so much for inviting me to speak today. My name is Kate Young. I am a program manager at the National Renewable Energy Lab. I've been there for 13 years, where we work to transform energy into the future. And so my background is in geology and geological engineering, and I've worked for the past several years developing in conjunction with others, a reporting tool called GeoReport, which is why I'm here on this panel. So that's the background that's relevant. So thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
All right, Kate, thanks a lot. Let's go to Harman Mindleaf now. Please introduce yourself, Harman.
Thank you, Anne. I'm honored to be on this panel discussion. I'm Harman Mindleaf. I'm working for the Geological Survey of the Netherlands, geologist by training, sedimentology and structural geology. I've worked in the oil and gas industry in a consultant company doing sedimentology and petrography, and then changed to the Geological Survey some 25 years ago, and been there ever since. And also in the same department, which is the advisory group for the Ministry of Economic Affairs. So I'm in a group which is the house consultant of that ministry, and that ministry has the licensing and everything related to the mining law in the Netherlands under its jurisdiction. And we are trying to assist them in their policy execution and the making of the policy. So that's licensing, that is subsidy schemes, that is industry standards, you name it, and it comes over my desk. And since about 10 years, since the heydays of geothermal in the Netherlands started, I've been involved with geothermal. First a little bit, and now more than 100%. So that is actually the work I do. And I think I might add from the discussion, also with the experience that I stand in front of an audience of the people, the society, who are going to have a geothermal project in their backyard, and they have lots and lots of questions not pertaining to the technical issues, but we do have to translate the technical issues to something they can understand and where they are comforting or getting more comfort out of these projects. So that will be my short introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Harman. Very interesting, and I'm sure we'll be tapping into you in this session. Next, I'd like to Gioia Falcone to introduce herself, please.
Thank you, Anne, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be participating in this unique event, which is Pivot 2021. I'm Gioia Falcone, ranking chair of energy engineering at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, where I'm also associate director of the Centre for Sustainable Solutions. I currently serve on the board of the International Geothermal Association and vice chairperson of the expert group in resource management of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. I like to be exploring all problems in the energy engineering space. So although I have a background in petroleum engineering, I then became more and more curious about geoenergy engineering problems, and more specifically geothermal engineering. And more recently, I've got more into the sustainability aspects of technologies development in the energy space. And I hope that we will be discussing a bit of that today as well. Thank you, Anne.
Very good. And last in our group is Derek Cromby. Derek, please introduce yourself.
Hi, thanks, Anne. So I'm my name's Derek Cromby. I am the VP of Subsurface and the VP of Software Development for the commercial software development team in a company called Lloyd's Register. My background actually is geoscience. I come from 30 plus years in oil and gas, subsurface geoscience. I'm a petrophysicist by trade, but over the years I'm also involved in software development, including asset performance, risk management. Lloyd's Register are a 300-year-old class society looking at risk and uncertainty and best practices. And basically, in the early 2000s, I got involved in a number of geothermal projects, mainly in Europe and places like the Rhine Valley, as a petrophysicist and working in a subsurface team. I'm very much interested in looking at how we can collectively make a safer and more sustainable world. And very pleased to be on this panel today.
Thank you, Derek. That's a great introduction. We're going to be talking today about standards and protocols. So I thought we should start by defining them and distinguishing between them. Standards create sort of a common language for guiding and controlling processes and activities. They specify definitions and performance and design criteria. Most industrial standards are voluntary, but mandatory standards are present too in many cases, and these are effectively equivalent to laws. And in the standards world, audits are used to determine compliance, see if they're being met or not. Protocols are different. They outline a process, they provide background about the why and when and where, to provide context to defining a problem. Protocols include specific methods and tools related to the process, but these can be sort of modified a bit and applied and adapted to fit the situation. And I'll just say that protocols are relatively common in geothermal. I was involved in one for induced seismicity some years ago, but standards are pretty rare. So my first question to the panel is this: is the lack of standards holding geothermal back? If so, what particular standards would help advance the geothermal industry and why? And I'd like to start with Derek. You're in the assurance business. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what standards exist for subsurface assurance and what additional assurance is needed to make someone, really want to be comfortable with geothermal and comfortable enough to invest.
Yeah, so just to be clear, that Lloyd's Register is not the same as Lloyd's of London. We're not an insurance company, but we do look at assuring the safe delivery of anything from A to B, and that could be anything, so including energy. And obviously, in subsurface, there are lots of risks, and including in the drilling, completion, environmental, safety. So you get risks for business, financial, reputational, human life, environmental, and so forth. So we need to, we look at standards to try and minimize those risks in order so you can assure that you're doing something safely and you're not going to take any penalties here. So you can go and get insurance because an insurance company is going to look at those things. So like I mentioned there are a number of areas that you could apply a standard, whether that is something that should come from the industry or be legislated is another question as well. But I think if the geothermal industry doesn't start looking at least looking at standards throughout. These are in areas around the world, these things will be legislated.
So I think what you're saying is that you need assurance to get insurance for these things. And you mentioned regulations, and I was wondering, can regulations effectively operationalize standards, or do you see them as two separate processes? They are two separate processes, but how do they interact, I think, is where I'm going with that question.
Well, there's always leaders and things. There are people that always will do things the right way, and others people that are sort of more forced to do things the right way to get to comply to standards. So they go hand in hand. If there's a standard to be met, then you need to make sure you can prove that you've lived up to that standard. Obviously, it's a chicken and egg scenario. You need to be able to show that you've done that, but equally, if you don't, if there's, the last thing we want is something to happen, and then we're forced to be reactive and have to come up with standards to show that to mitigate things. So I'm saying that it's probably more important to be proactive and look to see where it makes sense to apply standards. I mean, I'm not one that would advocate standards for standards' sake. They should give value and not just be applied just for the sake of it. There needs to be something tangible to get out of it. Basically my answer would be that you basically have to do both. You have to have assure that what you're doing is best practice or fit for purpose, to make sure that we're not taking risks. Looking at industries like nuclear or aviation, where they have a zero tolerance of risk, what sort of tolerance do we require in order also to assure the general public that we are a safe industry and an industry that you'd be happy to have in your backyard.
Thanks,
I think
Derek.
I'd like to add to that, Derek, is that say the law states in general that operations should be safe, that there is an acceptable risk attached to all the operations. And I would be sort of hesitant to have standards, definitions, and protocol in the legal environment. But the legal environment should point and direct to all these protocols and industry standards or whatever standards, because the technology will develop, and then you have to revise your laws, and to revise your laws takes quite a lot of time in general with all the things. But if you point to a lower hierarchy description or protocol which you should adhere, and that is accepted by the authorities and the people and everyone, and then stick to that, that would be a nice obligation and to earn the trust of all the people involved in geothermal. And that is not only the authority, but it's the investors. And let's not forget the general public. We need to gain the trust of everybody that we are indeed operating safe and sound and responsible.
Yeah,
It's true.
And I'd like to add too that as an industry, I think it's important to be able to report in a standard way that, the general public's understanding of geothermal, the investors' understanding of geothermal is not as detailed as the scientists that work in the field. And if you have different scientists reporting on the same location, on the same place with the same data, they're going to come up with a different description of what that looks like just based on their prior experience. And so what somebody might call a high temperature resource, somebody else might call a low temperature resource. And if you're talking to an investor or others in the industry, a stakeholder that needs to be involved and be a part of the development, they need to have we need to be able to communicate effectively and consistently as an industry so that people do build confidence in geothermal and the ability to develop. Because when somebody invests based on based on a non-standard report that is maybe overestimating a resource or a capability or a development, it is detrimental to the whole industry, because it starts to make people be more apprehensive about geothermal development.
Absolutely, I agree with that. And I've been in that situation where Geothermex has made an estimate and it's quite different, significantly different from another's. And that's based on the input data. And you're right, sort of the experience and perhaps a bit of bias, these things come into play. Joya, did you want to come? We're going to talk a little bit more about reporting standard later, but I thought if you had something you wanted to throw in here about that, go ahead.
Thank you, Anne. I was crazily taking notes because of points that have already been raised. Yeah, so first of all, just to muddle the waters even more, you mentioned standards, you mentioned protocols, but of course, as community, we've also seen guidelines and frameworks. And
absolutely.
so indeed, it is difficult to understand exactly what is doing what or what is aiming to do what. I was just thinking that, yes, it's important to also decide what these standards are trying to do. So are they referring to technical aspects or safety aspects, which of course sometimes are related? Are they aiming at maybe ensuring that there is nothing wrongdoing from the point of view of fair trading, and also from the point of view of social ethics of intervening in a certain place, in a certain country, within a certain sector? And I very much like what Kate said about communication. At the end of the day, it's a way of standardizing how to report information. And apart from the economic advantage of doing so in some specific applications, I was also thinking about when accidents happen, it is so important to be prepared to disclose information that would then be crucial to do a full accident investigation, to understand the liabilities of the accident, and also in case of litigations. So, Anne, you mentioned seismic report. So that is an important aspect, the redefinition of data that need to be collected during the intervention, and for the operator, for the organization doing those activities to be ready to present and share those data in a format, in a way that is usable.
Yes, and that informative and open and transparent, all that stuff that we need to do too. I want to turn to Harman for a minute, because earlier this year, the Netherlands adopted a sustainable well design standard. And the reason for this was cited to be to ensure well integrity, to protect groundwater resources, and I'm sure there's other elements of it too. It took about a year to develop this standard, but it was based on I will say Harman's 10 years in the geothermal sector, but it's the Netherlands' 10 years in the geothermal sector, and all the drilling and production experience that came along with that. And I think this group would like to hear a little bit more about that. And I'm thinking about, well, has it been incorporated into regulations, or does it stand alone? And maybe you could talk a little bit about its applicability in other jurisdictions beside the Netherlands.
I think I was personally not involved in the development. I've been watching it from the sideline, but it's rooted from experience in the geothermal sector. So the first wells which were drilled had just a single barrier, and that went well for a while, but we saw quite a lot of corrosion, and we saw quite a lot of scaling and problems with the screens, etc., etc. And so the well design was not good enough for the geothermal brines which were circulated, and that is quite a costly business to repair it. Some wells were actually even re-drilled. A lot of workovers have been done. Flow was diminishing because of all the patches in the well. So it is suboptimal, to be on the sensitive side. So we have been experienced it all, and there is also the authority will say this is not safe enough for example, our drinking water resources, because some of the leakages may go up to the sweet water resources. So they urged the sector to come up with an industry standard, and the sector has taken up this challenge and developed a new guideline or protocol, and or maybe what they call it an industry standard. And it's not obligatory, but our authority, who has to check the well design pre-drill, is going to look if you adhere to this industry standard. And you need to have very good arguments to deviate from it if it's going to be less well designed. So I think it is a good effort. It has the well, everybody feels happy with it. It is effective. It does cost more, but in the long run, in your operational stage of your project, it will save you a lot of trouble and a lot of money. It is
from interventions better. And so forth. Yeah,
exactly. It is also comforting the drinking water authorities. So it's better for all of it. And I think you can take it and copy it to any other location, but as with any standard, I think it needs to be amended to the local situation, because we only have, for example, relatively low temperature direct heat usage, and I don't think it is applicable to EGS or whatever. So you need to, but the procedure might be repeatable.
I like the fact that it's sort of not mandatory, but almost so. You went short of making it mandatory, but the authorities went short of making it mandatory. But in fact, you have to show that you've complied with it. So that's actually, I think, a nice middle ground approach. It can be called a standard, but it's not necessarily mandatory. And I think your point about, having 2 strings of cemented casing, for example, and that you're getting corrosion on the outside and scaling on the inside requires interventions. Obviously, protection.
That you can do monitoring in the annulus and all sort of things which are in the oil and gas industry more common than up to now in geothermal. But people realize that monitoring is essential, and good monitoring as well.
Yeah, surveillance is so important in any project, but particularly geothermal. You need to know what that resource is doing, not only to your wells, but to your productivity and production. So, does anybody else want to comment on that approach to standards? I'd encourage you to jump in. Derek, do you think that that's a good step for the Netherlands? And maybe the conditions won't be exactly the same in other places. I can tell you that in the US, it would be quite different to that in some places, and you'd have quite the saline brines, potentially corrosive fluids in others. Just interested to hear your comment on that, Derek.
Yeah, I mean, I said earlier that these standards or protocols should be basically of value in the
jurisdiction, whatever it is. Yeah.
So the ecological area and the environment and the particular project. I think having a standard or protocol that is completely fixed, that you can change it if better approaches can come along. I picked up on what Herman was saying about the standards that are not flexible. They can stifle innovation. So you do need to have some flexibility in there. The standards can be modified and changed. And they don't necessarily. I'm saying that they shouldn't really end up being legislated. It should be a standard applied by the industry itself. I think well integrity is an issue that everybody needs to be concerned with, as well as completions. Should we be using more ductile cement? Should we be having more of a steady state when we're producing from these flowing the hot water through the casing, rather than shutting off in the summer and opening up in the winter. Those sort of things need to be looked at. Having 2 sets of casing and cement, like I mentioned earlier, I personally get involved in development risk software for the nuclear industry, and they basically have this zero tolerance approach where it's boots and braces, to make sure that there is absolutely as much as we can possibly do to avoid any contamination or risk associated with this industry. And the last thing we really want is to be in the front page of the news for something that goes wrong.
Indeed. Not the kind of publicity that one wants. Joya, any comments there, or shall we move on? You tell me.
I was just going to say that Hammond gave us a fantastic example of a set of standards developed from a clear need. So this is important, I think. Do we need to
That's a great point.
without having a clear need, and do we try to over-regulate everything, or should we respond to specific needs and also tailor the standards to a particular sub-application within a specific subcontext?
Yeah, I like that too. And it seems to me that it's not inconsistent with, say, the rules in California or other states in the United States, where there is an option to deviate from a standard if you can prove that the engineering is correct, if you can make your case effectively to the regulator. And I think Derek, you mentioned stifling innovation, which was a topic I had thought about for later in the program here, but we might as well get onto it now. Regulations or standards may constrain people or make people complacent and always do it the same way. And in geothermal, we tend to get pretty darn creative with our solutions. So we like to have a little bit of freedom, a little bit of leeway to try something different, as long as it stands up engineering wise and safety wise. So that is not uncommon. Kate, you're on mute, and I'd be happy to hear you, but I'm going to ask you a question next, so you have to go off mute. Go.
Oh, yeah, well, I was just going to suggest that I think all of these things are really valid, and to Joya's point, if this is it really does have more impact when it's need-based. And what it does, that communication piece, it communicates that that there's been thought behind what it is that you're doing. So sort of the counterpoint to what you were saying, and that maybe we're going through the motions. I mean, when people put together these protocols and put together standards, they put a lot of time and a lot of thought and a lot of effort, yes, and a lot of expert and a lot of perspectives. And that's what you bring to a standard, and sort of what a protocol or a standard represents. And so even when you propose something different than a protocol and propose a different approach, it's saying, I'm aware of the protocol, I've thought about the protocol, and this is why this works better in this situation. And so I think even deviation is okay. What it does is give people confidence that there has been a lot of thought put behind what it is that you're doing, and that it's not something that slipped through the cracks.
No, that's a really good point. Harmon, go ahead.
Yeah, because there's a difficult point at a certain moment. If an operator is doing something innovative and wants to implement that in a project, they still need to convince the authority, I think, that it is safe and sound for everyone, environment, etc. And if that is not proven, or with a certain amount of uncertainty accepted, then it is a no-go. So innovation needs to have a playground in demo projects or whatever before it can be imposed in real project where, well, you can't withdraw things anymore. So you need to be fairly convinced as an authority that something will work. And that is, I think, one of the issues in geothermal. The amount of playground, the amount of demo projects is at the moment not enough to speed up all the innovations to show that things are actually worth using. So all the composite casing things that have been around since I started 10 years ago, they wanted to have that into geothermal, but there's not enough testing facilities to see that it's actually safe, as what I heard, and that is holding back from, say, the standards definitions point of view and from the regulator.
Very good. Now, Kate, I want to turn to you. As I mentioned, you mentioned the GeoReport project in your intro, and this includes so far protocols for assessment of geological and socioeconomic and technical issues, and it looks like a resource capacity estimate or assessment tool is kind of underway now, as I understand it. And I just wanted to know that even though GeoReport is described as being a basis for measuring and describing the impact of research, development, and deployment conducted by the U.S. Department of Energy, specifically the Geothermal Program Office, how else do you see these protocols being used, and how do you see them contributing to the growth of geothermal energy?
Yeah, and I think it gets back to what we were discussing earlier, which is just that GeoReport was meant as a way to consistently communicate among our community and to others outside of our community, so that when we're looking at 5 or 6 or 7 different projects, in the case of DOE, how do we make sure that we really understand the nuances and the differences between these projects or among the projects? And it's not to say that that some are better than others, but it really helps us understand the assets, and the challenges that might come up. And so, as an example, if DOE gives funding out to a project, and technically the project looked really amazing, but the scientists that are ready to do the research hadn't considered permitting because that's not their purview, and they give the money out and the project can't go forward because it can't get a permit, right? It really sort of stymies the research and the project progress and things like that. And so it's really a way to say, hey, have you considered all these things? Where are we at? And how does that compare, using consistent terminology, consistent thresholds among projects in any location. And so it really is applicable, beyond DOE's use. We had situations where a military base was calling and saying, hey, someone wants to deliver geothermal. I've got this stack of paperwork. Is it even relevant? It was from 20 years ago. Someone's telling me it's a really good idea. How do I know if I can believe them? Right. And so giving people like that some level of comfort in being able to communicate and compare consistently among different resources is important. And so the team at NREL now is actually working internationally with the IGA, with Iceland, with Jacobs Engineering, with others to internationalize the socioeconomic piece of it. And so that the technical and the geological pieces are pretty standard regardless of where you are in the world, but the socioeconomic piece that has to do with leasing or licensing, as some countries call it, and permitting and market trends may be variable as geographically throughout the world. And so working to make sure that works internationally is important. And I think it can be a valuable tool, with the World Bank or with others who are looking at investing in projects and saying, all right, among all of these projects that we're getting applicants for, how do they compare? How do we really compare apples to apples?
Thanks. And I think that's a great segue for Joya to come in on the United Nations Framework Classification Protocol, because that is exactly, in my view, one of the main reasons it exists is to enable comparisons between projects about their technical progress, about many aspects of them, including socioeconomic aspects. So, Joya, would you would you say that the UNFC, as far as it applies to classifying and quantifying geothermal resources, is a standard or a protocol, or is it something else entirely? How do you view it?
It's an interesting question. So the UNECE itself, which is the owner and holder of the UNFC, is never going to police how the UNFC is going to be applied by anyone. So the idea is that it's a free framework for anyone out there to choose to use or not to. And then different authorities, different countries, different corporates might decide to mandate its use, and then they might decide to manage how to implement and control and audit its use independently. So again, this is, I think, important in relation to who needs these tools and when
And for what?
become law, and then who is going to monitor that they're applied appropriately, and are they going to be used by competent people who have the competency for understanding what they're doing with that tool? Because no tool is bulletproof in terms of having no uncertain interpretation on what a parameter means or what a definition means. So it's interesting, but yes, the UNFC first came out in 1997, so it has a history, and then it's been developed over the years, adapted over the years. It encompasses at the moment multiple energy applications, and including geothermal, of course, as of 2016 formally. And it has always had that ternary approach since it was first conceived, and the idea being that the three axes would try and capture different aspects of a project, and really it brings in the project definition, which then relates to, rather than thinking about the poetry of infinite energy resources, unfortunately, you have to translate that into a project being feasible or not feasible, into activities being economic or not, into project activities being acceptable by the local communities. And so it has always tried to capture this, but as has been mentioned before, and as Kate stressed, it's difficult to standardize what social and environmental criteria are to be followed in different countries, in different places. So it's difficult to translate everything into numerical cutoffs or into you shall do this and you shan't do anything else but this. And so it has to be embedded all the time.
Thanks. And I just wonder, do you think, does it help high-level decision makers to understand what the uncertainties are in projects, or anyone else, not only such a decision maker? People make decisions about lots of things, about whether to approve a project, about whether to give a license, about whether to allow a certain activity to proceed. So what's your opinion on this? Does it help people with decisions?
Yeah, first of all, it's words can be quite important in this case. Are we talking about uncertainty? Are we talking about level of confidence? Are we talking about probability? Are we talking about risk? Mathematically speaking, also from the point of view of the stakeholders and the investors, they do mean different things. And the quantification of each of them requires different steps of analysis. So the NEC has an axis which is specifically called the level of confidence in the recoverability of a certain energy product from that given project. And so it gives you the spread of how much you think that project might be given to you. And in any energy project, you can never be absolutely certain that it's going to be just a one number. Definitely not. And we have
especially in geothermal, I would say, always a range, and until we drill and confirm, that this is how it goes.
So the first challenge is that definition of the uncertainty in the recoverability or the quantity, and then you attach a readiness for the project that would be giving you those quantities. And that readiness has to be judged from the point of view of how many studies have you done, it's a more data that you have to collect, or the more analysis you have to collect, technically speaking, and socially speaking. Have you already connected with the local communities? Do you have the social license to operate, which got many different meanings, of course? Is the project economically feasible? And from an environmental point of view, is it viable? But then again, if you want to police the environmental viability, you should really express environmental KPIs with actual formula of how many CO2 emissions are you going to generate with the project. And on social aspects, you could have things such as how many jobs is this project going to create? Are you to change the way of life of an indigenous community that has been like that for years and years.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to go from, the concepts are there and have been there for years. The problem is how to quantify without at the same time excluding options, as Harmin said.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that the KPIs are a really good point. I'm not sure that it's up to the industry to set those KPIs, but I think that investors or developers or directors have their own KPIs, and
Indeed.
being able to use these protocols or these frameworks or these standards to see if projects meet their KPIs is certainly a good use of these of protocols. And so, as an example, you might look at permeability, right? And so if you're looking to develop a hydrothermal project, you certainly have a certain threshold of maybe productivity or geochemistry that you want to hit for your target project. But if you're looking to mine lithium, you're going to want a different chemistry, right? Because you're going to be interested in that lithium. And if you're an EGS project, you might be looking for less permeability because you're really targeting these new technologies than you might be if you're hydrothermal. And so there's not a single standard that is going to meet everyone's need. And that's why having this protocol for communicating and reporting helps people better understand if it meets their own companies or entities' KPIs.
Yeah. And Derek, we talked about that a little bit when we first chatted, because I didn't know you, and we talked a little bit, and you were talking about ESG initiatives and how people need to know that, in fact, the performance of this clean energy project, in this case a geothermal energy project, is meeting their standards. Is that something you'd like to comment on now?
Yeah, we talked about protocols and standards sort of intertwined. I mean, we understand in any subsurface that there is uncertainty, and quantifying uncertainty, is a topic in its own right. But we were talking there about permeability and formation evaluation and understanding all the technical, what actually is the value of your asset, and in order to obviously you want to try and understand that as well as you can. And I think as a community, there are technical guidelines people could use to say that you've followed a particular approach to quantify. But looking at apples and oranges, how do you know that you're comparing one asset is the same as another asset? So start standardizing on how that is calculated and reported, and any good scientist will give an error or a range of uncertainty.
Yeah.
So when you go to the market to get investment, an investor can look at each of these and in more of a standard way.
And like the UNFC, be able to compare one project to another and decide which one might suit their needs the best.
Well, if the framework is I've not looked at the UNFC framework, but I would assume if you stick to that framework, that everybody would be, it would be a form of standardization. I would have thought.
So there's actually quite a number of comments in the chat about, how can standards apply across different resource types, across different jurisdictions. And I think that that this is in fact quite a problem, and it's not that we have to solve that. I think each jurisdiction has to solve it on their own. But this reminds me about drilling standards at this moment, because it's an obvious place where we need standards. Drilling is a risky business, and geothermal drilling is particularly risky. There's a lot of knowledge about it, It's been done for years, and I'll refer to the New Zealand Code of Practice for geothermal wells. This has become a de facto standard for high temperature wells, high enthalpy wells. But there are many types of geothermal wells, you know, shallow and deep, large diameter, small diameter, developed for different uses or into resources that have hugely different conditions. So the New Zealand Code of Practice has its place, but do we need more of those that fit other circumstances? Would this be a helpful element to increase confidence by the public and by investors? And I'll let anybody jump in there if they want to take it.
I think so. I'm happy to go next. So I think we do need more, because we don't have enough analog developments for every single type of geothermal engineering
situation. Yeah.
So, and this is for everything. It's also, so we don't have the subsurface manifesting itself always in the same way. You don't have clear cut-offs of physical parameters that apply all over. That's why we've got the different geological place. Also, we don't have enough history and enough expertise with all possible ways of engineering the same subsurface. And this event, Pivot 2021, I think has been superb in really showing with parallel other sessions the variety of the ideas that have been thrown out there on the table on how to go down there and recover the heat. And
extract heat, yes.
Oh, that might be at the borderline of being R&D. And so standards go with frequency of the event. So at the end of the day, in order to prescribe things to be done in a certain way, it means that you have enough projects, enough observations of the same event. So it's down to probability. And so if you haven't seen the same combination of parameters, combinations of cause and effect relationships, at least X number of times, you're just saying, you're just quoting one-off projects, but not necessarily repeatable projects. If you just, one just thinks about Monte Carlo simulation needs about 10,000 runs.
Yep.
So you need, so there are some applications that still don't have enough analog. So the prescribing of cutoffs and procedures becomes a bit clouded in the area.
Because we don't have a statistical body of knowledge that we can rely on.
So we need variety, but again, variety based on needs. So as Armin specified earlier, the industry standards for well designs in the Netherlands have been based on the history and the other over a number in the particular country, in those particular geothermal settings. And
domain, yeah.
Time for issuing.
Well, and I think that there's other reasons for developing cutoffs as well. And so we were working with the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management in the United States, on how do we put together a screening for our staff to be able to better understand whether induced seismicity might be an issue. And again, this comes down to communication, right? So if you have somebody in a field office who's never seen a geothermal project and they suddenly get an application and they're not a geophysicist, they're not a geologist, how do they know whether something warrants bringing in an expert or not? And so that's where I think, having some of those thresholds, that's basically what we did for them, is say, hey, what are the thresholds that this person can look at and say, this might be an issue. I should go bring in an expert to evaluate this, right? So, and if somebody's not injecting any water into a well, in other words, as an example, there's not a likelihood of induced seismicity, right? And so that would be a threshold, right? So there's different. I think there's value in thresholds, not just in saying yes or no to a project, but in saying yes or no, you need to gather more information. And so I think that's something to keep in mind when we're looking at thresholds.
That is actually to add on Kate's comment. I think that is the main issue. There is a question out there, and there's uncertainty around the issue. And then the only thing you need to do is to get a threshold on this uncertainty, whether it's regarded as accepted or not. And that is on any technical question, but also on any non-technical question. And I'm sort of convinced that all the questions pertaining to any geothermal project anywhere in the world is more or less the same. There's always technical questions, there's always social questions, and they're more or less the same. Am I going to be bothered by this project? How is my house coping with the geothermal project? And if we have a list of questions and have a good understanding of the uncertainty related to this issue, and then the policy needs to define a threshold which is acceptable, and if something happens, there needs to be a backup in the form of a damage protocol or a damage fund, and then you build trust. So having these protocols, these systems, these thresholds in place is essential to build trust. And you need to have the backup things in the damage handling as well, because if that's not there, then you probably end up with the same things we do encounter now in the Netherlands with the induced seismicity in this big Groningen and gas field.
I think you also need to tie it up with public education. You know, once we, it's all well and good having an industry that we are confident and making sure we're doing everything as risk-free as possible. Inevitably, something may go wrong, and you know we need to engage with the public and make sure that they understand that drilling a well down the road isn't an oil well; it's a geothermal well. What the difference is a, you know, is should we be even using the same terminology as we use in oil and gas? You know, it's a borehole rather than a well. You know, and actually
Depends where you are.
yeah, and you know, as for an industry, we need to also encourage continuous improvement, and that's going to happen through collaboration and everybody communicating with each other, and so and sharing knowledge and sharing experiences, and what works and what doesn't work.
And we're lucky that, you know, the geothermal industry is not a new industry, and so there is a history, and there are best practices that are followed, and they are, even though maybe not codified in the way we're talking about in standards, they're known, and they're you know, the New Zealand Code of Practice is an example of that. But you know, even your typical geothermal drilling engineer is rooted in all that history of drilling wells and designing them safely and doing the required calculations to ensure that your casing is strong enough and all that stuff. But you know, one thing that we haven't talked about much are reporting standards, and I'd like to maybe switch gears a little bit to that right now. It is you know, something that's been happening for a while. We have the Australian code and the Canadian code, interestingly coming out of the mining industry, which is not unusual. But what I do find unusual is that neither of those countries yet has any geothermal happening. But you know, how do we feel about these reporting codes? Are they enabling whoever needs to understand, anyone, to whether it's a member of the public or a regulator or an investor or anyone else, to really feel like they know this resource and they can rely on that report prepared by that competent person or persons? So any comments on those reporting protocols that you guys would like to talk about?
Yeah, I wanted to bring up to follow up on your point about Australia and Canada and the fact that they have protocols and don't have a resource. And I think that that's a really interesting point to bring up. And one of the reasons maybe that people have done it is to try to increase confidence to get the development there.
Yeah.
So we see the same thing with regulations, and although regulations are different, you know, if we have a development and you would know this too, Anne, if you're going to go into, let's say, the state of California or the state of Nevada, where we have a lot of geothermal development, you as a developer are going to have a lot of confidence in the idea that your project will get permitted. But if you are going to develop a project, let's say in another state that doesn't have geothermal development, you're going to have less confidence that they're going to know how to handle it and that you're going to get a permit and that they're going to know what to do because they haven't dealt with it before. And so I think that's one of the things that standards can do, particularly for areas that don't have development, is provide that level of comfort and a level of confidence to that jurisdiction as well as to developers going in, so that you have a common language that you can speak and there's not as much apprehension about, gosh, what's going to happen if I try to go do this.
And one of the best elements of those codes is that they do distinguish how certain you are about the resource with terminology. You have resources versus reserves, and resources, proven resources, and reserves. So there's the different classifications that are used. And I would say that, since, our company does a lot of due diligence and confirmation of resource capacity and things like this, for investment, it was actually a really helpful change. We just talked about reserves since it's a word that's used, but now we've reverted to saying, okay, you have a heat resource and you might have some reserves, but you haven't proven them yet. So this kind of advancement, which happened to us maybe 20 years ago, is very welcome. But I'm still not certain that those codes are the best for geothermal. Nevertheless, they were, I thought, a great start, and perhaps people will pick up on them more. I think
that's why we developed GeoReport, because we did try to use standards like that for other purposes, and they didn't seem to fit the needs that we had, and so that's why we developed GeoReport, because it was more specific and more focused on a lot of that early stage research that DOE is involved in, and it's we talked about the different types of standards, and Joya talked a lot about the UNFC, and I think that's very similar to those other codes, that is really about your project and how are you, and Joya, I don't mean to put words in your mouth about the UNFC, so feel free to correct me, but it's really about your confidence in that project and the project's ability to develop. And so one of the things that we've done to complement that is to develop standards for reporting the resource grade. So it's independent of project, and it's about, how hot is it, how easy is it to permit at that location, regardless of what you've done, right? But just based on the inherent characteristics of that place and that location. And so it really gives two different perspectives that in combination are a really effective way to communicate.
Very good. Thank you.
The thing is, I think, in communicating the results. So if you stick to the standards and the protocols, and that stays on a technical level, then it's very difficult to be used by the policymakers and the people within the municipality who have a task to change their energy consumption. So there is inevitably a translation from the technical point of view in something which the policymakers can use and understand, and which is connected to the technical level, but can be used in the policy domain. And that is the main challenge, I think. The policymakers do not know the subsurface things. They know whether a project or a resource or whatever it is viable according to all the standards you set, whether it's economic, social, and safety terms. That is what they know. They just want to have one mark. Is it good or not? And maybe with a grading, and that's where they make their policy on. Policy is a matter of black and white. It's a decision, and we are in the gray. And that is where you have to find a solution.
You're right, and we're getting very close to the end of our time, and we should be taking some questions from the audience now. But I just wanted to mention quickly that I know that at three of our panelists, that's Harman, Joya, and Kate, have all indicated that you're collaborating with the International Geothermal Association on a sustainability protocol, which I think is a very interesting thing. Now we can't, we don't have time now without answering, we'd ignore all the great questions coming in if we spent time on that. But I just wanted the audience to know that this is underway. And I believe Marit Brommer is going to introduce that at the World Geothermal Congress in Iceland, which will be in person, hopefully in late October. So people might look forward to that. Okay, now I think it's, my goodness, if I scroll through these questions, it's too much to go through right now, but let us take a few. One I thought that was really interesting is how this topic interacts with social license for geothermal, and what entities outside of governments should take the lead in developing standards to ensure that the social license is covered. Joya, do you want to, you're on mute. If you do want to answer, I'll just turn it over to you perhaps.
Thank you, and it's a very interesting question. So I'll start from the second part of the question. I would say it all depends on who is going to be using the standards, who is going to be applying for or granting the social license to operate. Mm-hmm. And I would say that this is again down to, there cannot be one method, one standard that can fit all uses and all needs. And so is the social license to operate that is being pre-assessed by a country that wants to have a general pre-assessment of the potential for doing geothermal energy in that country and how it could be accepted? Or are we talking about specifically already the level of one well-defined project, which is probably already technically mature from the point of view of technical studies, and the one missing point is just the social license to operate? So we have seen with different forms of energy that the SLO is managed and audited and granted by different organizations, different groups in different countries. So that is one thing that we find difficult to standardize, for example.
Yes, and I think that's a problem across this whole topic, in that we have so many types of resources, many types of jurisdictions, many types of issues that we're trying to sort of coalesce into a favorable project.
And I think that the society itself, the communities themselves, they will have to be given more ammunitions to judge themselves whether a proposition is socially feasible or not. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Those KPIs, if you could start really relating sustainability and social license to operate to the sustainability development goals and give numbers to criteria, then that could be making it easier from both sides, those applying for and those having to grant or not the SLO.
And another related question is about whether or not oil and gas companies can help build the public trust in this new, since oil and gas companies are, entering, and well, many have been in geothermal for a little while, but certainly many more are entering today. Derek, would you like to maybe jump in on that one? What do you think about that? Is there a role for oil and gas in building public trust?
Yes, obviously, as we know, in some communities, oil and gas isn't necessarily seen in the good light, in a good light.
Another comment, I've noted that too, and I was going to get to that, but thanks for saying it. Yeah.
I mentioned earlier about engaging with the public and educating the public and reassuring them that this is not necessarily the same thing. We all know that oil and gas has given a lot of good things to the world, and but we haven't necessarily instilled that or made that ever be aware of all the good things that the oil and gas has provided. It's not just about internal combustion engines and fossil fuel, and equally, geothermal is effectively a subterranean heat exchanger that can be used for good, to heat and to make electricity and power. People see the benefit of it, and it's showing that benefit to the public. And I'm not saying that the oil and gas is getting involved is a good thing or a bad thing. I think it can be equal. Oil and gas companies have a lot of proven technology that can be brought to the, but equally there is some baggage that we have to get over. And that's why I was suggesting that perhaps when we talk to the public, that we try and avoid referring to oil and gas. We use
We set ourselves apart, in other words, yeah.
Have to set ourselves apart. Really.
Yeah. I'll have to stop you there. I'm getting the 5-minute warning, but there's one more comment that I want to throw out to everyone, and it is, will standardization too early kill innovation in this space? It seems like we've barely scratched the surface on geothermal energy, geothermal anywhere. Of course, that's something Pivot has been about too. Would imposing standards hold this back? Who wants to comment on that?
Yeah,
Go, Kate.
I'll say, I think it depends on what standard or protocol you're describing. So if it's something that's very technical, I think Harmon alluded to this earlier, when you're trying to innovate, that it can be hampering. But if it's a standard about how we communicate, then I think it can be enabling, right? Then I think it can help bring the public along and bring investors along with what it is we're trying to do. And so I think it really depends on what that standard is.
And I think Joya wants to weigh in too. I get that feeling.
No, I actually totally agree with what Kate said. It depends on what it is for. And as it was mentioned earlier, sometimes the fact that organizations are working on standards can actually be taken as an indication that there are organizations and countries that are getting serious about promoting and supporting that particular sector. So it's not, no one would really put in place workforces to kill something, and no one would waste resources, time and money to kill something nascent. But also I would say, and as you said earlier, geothermal is not new. So we should also look back at what we did as a sector and why did we miss the boat on quite a few opportunities when we had so many degrees of freedom. Why didn't we let it pick up then? And make also missed opportunity, for example, when the oil price was going down and potentially there were so many drilling rigs available out there, and we had very, very few standards for geothermal from all aspects. So I really wouldn't see the risk of suffocation of an industry. This is not a nascent industry. It's been established, knows how to do the business, maybe hasn't called things for what they are, but has done things already. And the development of standards, protocols, codes is just there to reinforce that there is a will to move things forward and to upscale.
Thank you. And I think we have to stop there and proceed to your 1-minute wrap up. So this is I always found this the toughest part of the session, but I'm going to start with Derek. What are you taking away from this, and what would you leave the audience with?
Good question. I was just sitting thinking there about, I think we need a balance. We can't be so maverick that we go offside and we don't take the community with us and the public with us. So there needs to be a balance to assure that we're always thinking risk, and not necessarily always about money. It's about that balance we need to assure, so that ultimately, we do attain a better and safer world, and that doesn't mean we stifle innovation by being too restrictive using standards, but we do also have to consider and be proactive rather than reactive. As an industry, we should be leading the way and not having things imposed on us when in the future, if things go wrong. We should be avoiding things going wrong as much as possible. Well
said. Kate, would you like to go next?
Sure. I think that in my 1 minute, I'd like to stress and emphasize the importance of consistent communication. And so when we're focused on reporting standards, whether it be for sustainability or resource grade or a project viability, I think that one of the biggest things that we can do as an industry to build community and investor and public confidence in what we're doing is having consistent communication. And building that trust with our stakeholders and with the public. And so I think that's a big area that the industry can can grow is in its reporting standards and communication consistency.
Thank you, Kate. Harmon, your 1 minute of fame.
1 minute of fame, that's going to be complicated, but I would see a project as a sort of a present to the community. And it's wrapped, and maybe all the protocols, laws and standards and definitions may be seen as red tape. But if you pack this present very well, it will be a present and not a surprise. So you need all the things together to build trust for the community. And that's, I think, what standards and protocols can do.
Wrapped up with a bow. I like that. Joya, you get the last word.
Well, my takeaways are, number one, we only scratched the surface with this very important
True.
topic. So much to be discussed, but it was incredibly useful. Thank you very much. Number two, that there isn't one solution that fits all, and variety is great. And also evolution of standards will always be necessary. Even if you develop the perfect tool, you will still need to be continuously maintained and evolved annually or even more frequently. And finally, as Armin said, I also believe that ultimately we should be here to develop energy as a service to sustainable development. I think we have talked quite a bit from the point of view of the operators, but likewise, one can have this conversation from the point of view of the society that today is clearly showing that wants to develop more sustainably moving forward, and the clock is ticking with regards to where this planet is going.
Thank you, Joya. And I will just say thank you to all of you for a great session. It was really interesting to me. And thanks to Jamie and the organizers of Pivot for suggesting this topic. I think it was interesting, and hopefully the audience did too. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.